This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers Seminar 6, Lectures 1 and 2. Everything of importance in psychoanalysis, what Lacan calls marginal or residual phenomena, from dreams to slips of the tongue, to witticisms, to symptoms and inhibitions, acquires its importance due to their connection to desire. And so, the central question Seminar 6 will ask is this: what is desire? But it won't only ask about desire. It'll also ask about other concepts related to desire that Lacan has touched upon but not fully developed yet. So a little bit later, he'll say, it will be our goal this year to try to define what fantasy is. The two aims of defining desire and defining fantasy will be intimately intertwined. The first two lectures of this seminar offer somewhat of a review of Seminar 5, and Lacan acknowledges some of his audience's difficulties in understanding the graph that he presented there, which comes somewhat of a relief given how difficult it might have been for many of us. Yet, as he has done before, he warns against understanding too much, and in what appears to be a somewhat sarcastic tone, he congratulates and expresses envy for those who do understand, stating, even after 25 years of practice, that is not the case for me. I highlight this point because I think it is helpful as a reminder that what Lacan is presenting us is not some finished product, but an expression of his own working out of problems that he has yet to fully master. This series is called Thought in Motion because we're never presenting the finished thought of Lacan, only offering snapshots of moments of that thought as it unfolds and changes throughout these seminars. Then Lacan says something intriguing here, that the aim is not so much to understand what he is saying as it is to know what he is saying. What's the difference between understanding and knowledge? He doesn't provide a clear answer in this context, but from previous seminars, we can likely say that it concerns the difference between an imaginary understanding that is a fundamental misunderstanding and that serves as an obstacle to the kind of knowledge that's located on the symbolic register, which is knowledge of the truth about unconscious desire. As such, we might derive from this little aside by Lacan that understanding the graph, what each symbol means and how they are related to each other, does not necessarily mean that one will have the skills to access the truth of desire both in oneself and in the analysand if you're doing psychoanalysis. And yet, I would like to add to this that it's a dialectical relationship between understanding and knowledge, since to arrive at symbolic knowledge, I believe one must always pass through imaginary understanding, and there's probably no other path to get there. And that what you'll get from me in this series of videos, as you've always gotten from me in previous videos up to this point, is an earnest attempt at representing Lacan's thought in a manner that will inevitably misrepresent his thought due to my own limitations in conjunction with Lacan's. And hopefully it will be in a manner that will be ultimately beneficial for your own intellectual journeys as you seek to surpass what I have to offer. And if these videos assist you to do so, to surpass what they're presenting, to see the holes and weaknesses in their presentation, then they've in some way done their job. So what is desire? In Lecture 1, Lacan mentions various psychoanalytic and philosophical approaches. In psychoanalysis, and with Freud in particular, there was an emphasis on the psychical energy powering desire named libido. However, at the time Lacan was giving this seminar, and very likely up to the present day that I'm giving this video presentation, there has been a shift from Freud's original formulation of the libido as pleasure-seeking to it being object-seeking, exemplified by the work of Fairbairn and other object relations theorists. Lacan does not see this as a positive development, but as a deviation in theory and practice. Nonetheless, in this seminar, Lacan says he will not speak so much about libido or object, and instead examine desire itself in a manner that exceeds the dichotomy of pleasure seeking and object seeking. Lacan also mentions the need to separate desire from other associated terms, such as love and affectivity. But as for what desire is, Lacan will need the entire seminar to develop his response. Perhaps the most significant contribution to an answer in this introduction to the seminars is his claim that desire has an intimate relation with language. And if psychoanalysis has any fundamental law that governs it, for Lacan, it concerns the fact that subjectivity is fundamentally dependent on language. It's what allows the mind to extend beyond mere sensory experience and stimulus response mechanisms. And the very fact that humans speak presupposes that one has entered into a language and a discourse that always already precedes the subject. That the subject is, so to speak, thrown in midstream into raging waters that will carry the subject along in ways that are not under conscious control. An important distinction Lacan makes is between signs and signifiers. Signs represent something to someone, which is the common way language is understood by most of us. Signifiers relate to other signifiers rather than representing an object. When the psychologist approaches matters in terms of stimulus response, it concerns signs. The bell signals the food to the organism that responds by salivating, just to use the Pavlovian research example. The signifier functions differently. They're marked by their differences with other signifiers. So they're not referring to some real world object. And this relationship among signifiers is the theoretical foundation for how these signifiers are able to be substituted for one another in a manner that produces new meanings and enriches experience. The heart of these first two lectures concerns Lacan's rearticulation of the graph of desire in terms of three levels. These levels are not to be confused with developmental stages, but as different levels of discourse that operate simultaneously. Level 1 concerns the transformation of need by the introduction of signifiers, leading to our first identifications. Level 2 introduces the discourse of the other that intersects with the subject's discourse, giving rise to an encounter with and a question concerning the other's desire. The third level deals with the helplessness in the encounter with the other's desire and the attempt to deal with the anxiety it evokes through the imaginary relationship, part of which will be taken up to give rise to an unconscious fantasy that will situate and stabilize the question of desire along particular coordinates. Now, with the first level, we have a line that moves from the id all the way to the capital I. It's dotted up to the M, and this is called the line of intentionality. Across the two lectures, however, this line gets identified in a number of ways. The infant's discourse, the subject of need, the subject supposed to exist. These various names for this line, as different as they all sound, are linked by the fact that they are mythological reconstructions and abstractions that are always retroactively posited after having acquired language. The beginning of the line, marked by the id, is the originating point of need. Now in this graph, the line is dotted or fragmented up to lowercase s, uppercase a, where is the message, is symbolized by M in the other graph, and is dotted due to the retroactive effect of discourse on need as it becomes articulated in demand. The retroactive effect language has on need leads to a fragmentation of the subject's intentionality, which is what these dotted lines are signifying. The fact that the line does not return to this point after having passed through the signifying chain indicates that we never return to the originating source of need after being introduced into language. Line D represents the signifying chain, the systematic organization of language into a diachronic sequence, that is, one that unfolds over time. In Lecture 2, this line is referred to as the line of demand, or where need gets articulated. S stands for the signifier. And of course, what we're dealing with here are a chain of signifiers. The first intersecting point is C, which stands for code. This concerns the simultaneity of signifiers. So we already mentioned about the diachrony of signifiers of the chain, that it unfolds over time, but there's also a simultaneity, a synchronicity of signifiers. And this is what in Seminar 5 is called not only the code, but the locus of signifiers. It's the narrow doorway through which the subject's needs must pass through to be satisfied. The second intersecting point, M, is the place of signification, where the message is produced. The message takes shape only after having passed through the code. Yet in the unfolding of the signifying chain, the message also precedes or gets ahead of the code in being formulated before it has been, so to speak, validated at point C. So in one sense, the child speaks and in speaking discovers the meaning of its speech only after the fact of having been received and responded to by the other. And speaking of this relation to the other, this is the other who is omnipotent, who as the sum total of signifiers is the place where one places their demands, and the subject is completely beholden to this other for articulating their demands and for having the needs expressed through those demands potentially satisfied. And it will be this encounter with the omnipotent other who will provide the raw material for the child's first identifications, serving as the nucleus for the formation of the ego. And this is symbolized here at capital I. Whereas the first level concerns the subject's apprehension of language, the second level of the schema concerns a subject's apprehension of the other to whom the subject appeals. Here, the subject encounters the other's desire and the question, que vuoi? What do you want? The question marks a recognition of a beyond of linguistic articulation, that in speech passing through and being shaped by the code, something is left unsaid. At the same time, since the articulations of the speaking subject are the discourse of the other, this question is the other's response to the subject's act of speaking. It is a question that responds to a question, and hence we have the double lines arising with it. A way to concretize this, perhaps, is thinking about a child approaching their parents asking for a snack, and the parent vaguely responds that they're not going to do that right now. And the child's implicit question at this point is, what do you want? What is it that will satisfy your demands so that I can get my own demand satisfied? And hence why the child will persist in asking the same question or variations of questions like, why can't I have it? Why? And trying to determine how they can meet or satisfy the other so as to get what they want. Conversely, the parent, in hearing the child whine and making dozens of demands, might ask the child in exasperation, what do you want? As parents are often inclined to say when they hear their child whimpering or whining about something and they're not expressing what exactly they're looking for. Now, of course, these examples are misleading since the level at which the question que vuoi is raised is not conscious, but I think it's helpful in one way in illustrating the intertwining of desires between subject and other, and how behind the articulated demand, there's another question that's arising, one that's often not being spoken, but which is functioning in and through behind the scenes of the demand. Now, whereas at the first level, the code, the trove of signifiers, was simply there as a set of options to choose from, the recognition of the other now shows that choice itself to be under the power of the other as well. That the choice itself is determined in advance by a discourse that is situated at the level of the other. And I think the reason why here is because how I formulate my own demands now take into account a question concerning the other's desire that has to be, in a sense, taken into account, and that shapes my own formulations of demand going forward. And so this situation introduces a new dynamic where the process of enunciation is distinguished from the formulation of the enunciated. So what does that mean? The process of enunciation concerns the unconscious subject who performs the act of speaking and who is not necessarily included explicitly in the content of the speech act itself. It is the form that gives rise to the content, but that recedes in the background behind the content. That content refers to the formulation of the enunciated, or what will be later called the statement. This is the explicit, visible part of speech. It is what is said, but it does not necessarily contain the truth of the statement itself. For example, consider the statement, I am lying. The I in this sentence is the subject of the enunciated, the grammatical subject. However, the act of saying, I am lying, involves another level where the subject of enunciation might be revealing some unconscious truth about itself in saying it is lying. And we can think back as far back as Seminar 1, where Lacan says that there's often more truth in lies than there are in supposedly factually true statements. One way this split finds expression is through the principle of substitution of signifiers for other signifiers, which has the effect of producing and multiplying significations. And this allows the place where the message was identified previously on the first level to now constitute the signified of the other and to be in opposition to the signifier given by the other. The signifier of the other is produced along the dotted chain here, which is only partially articulated, which is implicit, and that represents the subject underpinning speech. At the end of Lecture 1, Lacan provides the example of a story originally recounted by Darwin, wherein at a party, one of the guests says, I hear that dear old Lady Cork has been overlooked. The key signifier is overlooked, which substitutes for the signifier ill or not well. But the substitution with the word overlooked allows a different meaning to emerge, one not possible with the signifier ill, that being the devil. The word overlooked has some connections with inflicting an evil eye, and this is especially seen in the works of Shakespeare. And in John Milton's Paradise Lost, Satan is depicted as overlooking Adam and Eve. So this is why the use of the signifier here evokes the notion of the devil in this English-speaking audience, communicating to them that Mrs. Cork is at death's door, and it's not entirely a bad thing either. Now, it's important to note that it's not necessarily the intention of the speaker to express this meaning, that they might have wanted to communicate the illness of this individual and not communicate this other aspect, that's this meaning that ultimately gets established. But this is where the process of enunciation becomes relevant, as it is the process whereby substitution takes place and pointing us back toward this enunciation. And so it is with these gaps between enunciation and enunciated, signifier and signify, that one finds the origin of desire. That gap is also talked about here as being situated between the manifestation of demand, of need, and the demand to be recognized or loved. It's also the case that desire is linked to the being of the subject, and the gap between the two levels of demand marks the horizon of being. Again, it's not clear what Lacan means exactly here by this in this context alone, but from other seminars we can perhaps find some insights. And first, it's important to be clear that being, in the manner Lacan uses it, is not some pre-existing essence. It is an effect produced by signifiers through the process of enunciation. But because what gets produced by signifiers is a product of the relation between the subject and the big other, that relation is also what impedes the inclusion of certain signifiers. They are elided. This exclusion produces a lack of being, which is the origin of desire. And desire then is always a desire for being, a recognition of these elided signifiers to bring them into speech. And this desire for being is opposed to, for example, the desire for having, which is what takes place at the level of demand. Now, since this desire is first the other's desire, we are dealing then with the lack in the other, which will in turn allow me to recognize my own lack. So Lacan captures a lot of this in a quote that I'll read to you. There is something in this other that always places the subject at a certain distance from his being, that can never reach it except in the metonymy of being, in the subject that is known as desire. Because in a relationship with the other as locus of speech, there is a signifier that is always missing. The signifier that is specifically assigned to the relationship between the subject and the signifier, the phallus. The phallus is the signifying element that is subtracted from the chain of speech. Thus, the phallus is a signifier representing a missing part of our being, symbolizing the unattainable aspect of desire. There's also a link here with the concept of death that Lacan briefly mentions, and we can see that in the anecdote by Darwin that Lacan recounts, but not much more is said about it, so we'll leave it there. The third level concerns the subject's distress and helplessness in the encounter with the other's desire. Anxiety is a signal in the ego that responds to this helplessness, and it is the subject that uses the ego as a defense against this anxiety through the construction of fantasy in having the imaginary relationship taken up by the symbolic. Such fantasies situate and stabilize desire, fixing desire in a particular manner. So as such, in this third level, we're also introducing the imaginary relationship. This is not the primordial relationship of the image of the mother and the infant child recognizing themselves at the mirror stage. This has to do with the subject that has already been brought under language, the speaking subject, and their relationship with the little other. So we bypass the fully imaginary relationship to introduce the symbolic, and this gets all represented here through these symbols. And this is the symbol that comes to represent fantasy in the unconscious. And Lacan adds here that the little other that is presented here is not merely some ideal ego, but actually functions as a gaze. And this relation between speaking subject and imaginary other as gaze is what situates and stabilizes desire so that it becomes fixed and attached, not to an object, but to a fantasy. What does it mean for the little other to be a gaze? How is this part of what makes up a fantasy? Again, we don't have any answers yet, and I'm not going to try to over elaborate what's not there in the lectures. But we have a lot of questions that we'll have to further unfold throughout this seminar, and hopefully we'll get some clarity around this over the period in which we cover the seminar. If you found the video helpful and you want to support this work, some ways you can do that is by liking the video, sharing it on other social media platforms, subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And if you want to support this work financially, there's a couple ways you can do that. One is through the Super Thanks button on YouTube below this video. And to be a regular ongoing supporter, you can do so on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts, unedited materials, and prioritize questions and comments here on YouTube. The link is below. I would like to thank the following for already supporting this work on Patreon. So we're finally here on Seminar 6. And even though there was a lot that was very familiar in these first few lectures, given what we've already covered in Seminar 5, I can begin to see some of the unique ways in which the concepts will be developed here. And as I'm reading this, I'm having in the back of my mind the big seminar, Seminar 7, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. And I think we can already start to see some of the development of ideas that will lead into what we find in that seminar. Like, for example, the gaze and the notion of fantasy is getting developed. It won't quite be objet a yet. It starts sounding more and more like it, but I think we have a few more seminars before we finally arrive there. But I think this is exciting as we get into some of the heart of Lacan's thinking leading up to Seminar 7. So I look forward to coming back to this seminar soon. And until then, thank you for watching. Be well.